When you hear the Doolittle Raid, you probably think of American heroism, right? It was the first big strike back at Japan after Pearl Harbor. But what if I told you that's only half the story? There's a second story, a much larger and frankly more tragic one that almost never gets told. It's about an unbelievable sacrifice that happened after the famous raid.
So you have one single historical event, but two completely different stories. You've got the American version, a gutsy, tide-turning mission. And then there's the Chinese experience, a story of incredible courage, followed by a tragedy that's almost too big to wrap your head around. So what really happened here? Let's dig.
Okay, first up, desperate times, audacious plan. To really get why this mission even happened, you have to go back to the first few months of 1942, and things were bleak. I mean, America was just reeling. Pearl Harbor wasn't just a military loss, it was a deep national trauma, and it was followed by one humiliating defeat after another. Morale was at rock bottom. President Franklin Roosevelt was in a really tough spot. He knew it would take years to get America's war machine fully up and running, but what he needed right now was a symbol. He needed a sign that America was still in the fight, you know? He had to buy time, and that's exactly why he started pushing his military leaders to do the unthinkable: attack Tokyo itself. But this created a massive puzzle. On the one hand, you have the Navy's planes. They could take off from aircraft carriers, sure, but they didn't have nearly enough range to hit Japan and get back. Then you have the Army's B-25 bombers. They had the range, no problem. But these were huge, heavy, land-based planes. The idea of getting one to take off from the tiny runway of a pitching ship at sea, it seemed completely impossible.
So this brings us to part two. A mission deemed impossible. When you have a problem that everyone says can be solved, who do you even call? Well, you find a guy like Lieutenant Colonel James Jimmy Doolittle. This guy wasn't just some daredevil pilot. He had a PhD in aeronautics from MIT. He was this perfect mix of brilliant engineer and world-class pilot, the exact person you'd want to turn impossible into a real plan. And the plan Doolittle came up with, wow, it was audacious. Step 1, take 16 massive Army bombers and launch them off a Navy carrier, something that had literally never been done before. Step 2, fly for hours just skimming the waves at treetop level to stay under Japanese radar. Step 3, hit strategic targets right in the heart of Japan. And the final crazy step, just keep flying on to these makeshift airfields in China, where, by the way, no one had even been told they were on their way. Every single part of this was a monumental gamble.
Yeah, this was not an order you could just give to someone. The plan was so out there, so incredibly risky, that the military had to ask for volunteers. The men were told flat out that the mission was extremely hazardous and that their chances of survival were very, very low. And every single one of the 80 airmen stepped forward.
All right, part 3, 30 seconds over Tokyo. So it's April 18th, 1942. The plan is a go. But the real drama kicks off hours before they even get near Japan. Way out at sea, the American fleet gets spotted by a Japanese patrol boat. This forced a massive decision. Do we turn back or do we launch right now? They decided to launch 10 hours early and a whole 200 miles farther from Japan than they had ever planned.
And that one single decision, that is what turned a dangerous mission into what was essentially a suicide mission. Launching from that much farther out meant burning a ton of extra fuel. So as those crews took off from the deck of the USS Hornet, they knew they almost certainly did not have enough gas to make it to safety in China. They were flying a one-way trip. And yet, incredibly, the bombing run itself was a jaw-dropping success. Because they launched early, they showed up a full day before Japanese intelligence thought any attack was even possible. The city's defenses were totally caught off guard. The Raiders hit their military and industrial targets. One crew even reported seeing a baseball game in full swing as they flew over. And against all possible odds, all 16 American planes made it out of Japanese airspace without a single one being shot down.
And this is where the American story of military triumph basically ends, and where a very different and much, much darker story begins. A story of survival, of rescue, and of absolutely brutal retaliation.
Their luck just ran out over the East China Sea. They flew straight into a nasty storm in the pitch black of night, and their fuel gauges all hit empty. The crews had no choice. They either had to bail out, parachuting into total darkness, or try to crash land their planes. They ended up scattered all over the mountains and rice paddies of rural Japanese-occupied China, injured, alone, and now hunted. And this is where ordinary people become heroes. There was this English-speaking student, Tong Shanglu, who was being smuggled through Japanese lines. He gets pushed into a room, and inside he finds 5 guys who are completely muddy, dirty, and just terrified. It turned out to be 5 American pilots. They couldn't speak a word to each other, but in that moment, Tong made a decision that would change his life forever. He decided to help.
And Tong wasn't some exception. All across eastern China, the same story played out. Ordinary civilians, farmers, fishermen, teachers, people who had never even seen a Westerner before, risked being executed on the spot to help these strangers. These were people with next to nothing, and they chose to hide, feed, and guide these foreign soldiers on a treacherous 1,000-mile journey to safety.
But that heroism, it came at a cost that is just horrifying to comprehend. In the end, 8 of the American Doolittle Raiders were either killed in crashes or executed by the Japanese. But in retaliation for the Chinese people helping them, the Imperial Japanese Army unleashed a campaign of pure terror that killed an estimated 250,000 Chinese civilians. 250,000 people. This revenge mission was called the Zhejiang Jiangxi Campaign, and it was monstrous. The Japanese army burned entire villages and cities to the ground. They tortured and executed anyone even suspected of helping the Americans. They even used biological warfare, deliberately spreading plague and cholera by leaving out tainted food and water for a starving population. This was the unbelievable price the Chinese people paid for their kindness. So now we get to our last section, a legacy across generations. Because out of all that shared trauma and incredible sacrifice, something amazing was forged. An unbreakable bond, a legacy that has now spanned decades and even generations. This bond that started in 1942 has proven to be incredibly strong. It began with the rescue of 64 American airmen. After the war, it continued when the Raiders started inviting their families to reunions. Then, decades later, the children of those Raiders traveled to China to walk in their father's footsteps. And then in 2020, in this really poignant moment, the descendants of the rescuers and the rescued exchanged life-saving medical supplies during the COVID-19 pandemic. For the next generation, this history became deeply personal. After visiting the very village where his own father was saved, one of the Raiders' sons said this: "I came over with 4 nationalities, but I was going home with 5 because I added China to one of mine." I mean, that just shows you the profound impact this shared history had. So all of this brings us back to that fundamental question. What is the true impact of a single act of war? For America, the Doolittle Raid was a huge propaganda win that lifted the nation's morale. Militarily, it forced Japan to pull back forces to defend its homeland, which actually had a big impact on the pivotal Battle of Midway. But it also led to the deaths of 250,000 civilians.
and somehow created this bond of humanity that has now lasted for 80 years. And you know, maybe that's the real takeaway from this incredibly complex story. That no matter what the politics are between governments, no matter what the conflict is, there are still ways for human beings to relate to each other and help each other survive. Beyond the bombs, beyond the propaganda, maybe that shared humanity is the true and the most enduring legacy of the Doolittle Raid.